Okay. Okay. And here we are live. Ellin, it's so exciting and wonderful to meet you. I assume that you're in Richmond Hill in Canada.
Yes, just north of Toronto. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
And I am east of Tel Aviv. One of the wonders of the modern world is that I can meet you and interview you, even though you're like a zillion billion miles away, but we're very close actually. And
I want to share my condolences before we go any further on the death of Tevye. The whole Jewish world is sad, and all his fans, Fiddler fans and his acting fans, heard about this overnight, and we're very, very sad to hear the news.
And I was fortunate to meet him on several occasions. A wonderful human being, not only a wonderful actor, a wonderful human being. Professor Ellin Bessner of Montreal, Ottawa, and North Toronto. It's wonderful to have you on the show. And my name is Mel Rosenberg, before I forget. And I'm usually the host of the Children's Literature channel of the New Books Network. But today I'm interviewing you on another subject. You are the incredible author of, I'm going to read this so I get the name right. Oh, okay. So Double Threat, Canadian Jews, the Military, and World War II, published by the New Jewish Press.
The University of Toronto Press, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, a few years ago. And I am really apologetic. I didn't know about the book. And one of the great ironies in the world is I have a dear friend in Greece, the Professor Vasiliki, I want to get her name right, Yakomaki. And maybe I hope she's watching. Hi, Vasiliki. And it's funny that a Greek professor of anthropology should bring us together, but she's very, very keen on preserving the history of Jews in Greece and Crete. And she's in Israel more than most Jews are. So she brought us together, Ellin Bessner, and it turns out that you have family in Ottawa. I'm from Ottawa. You grew up in Montreal. We have a lot of things to talk about.
Right, and also this Greek connection is very, very important, this Crete connection, right? That's how, this is a World War II story, Jewish-Canadian World War II story as well. So maybe we'll talk about that as well.
Okay, so I'd be happy if you talked about that as well. But I guess a few words, first of all, about your really incredible book and what brought you to spend years writing it. This is a real labor of love. I don't want to say it's a labor of intense love, maybe.
Well, it became a mission. Thank you. You're right. It's very intense and hasn't stopped because we stumbled on this story. And although I'm sure many people in families in Canada, around the world, who had relatives, uncles, aunts, fathers, brothers, cousins, great uncles now who fought in the Second World War on either side, but mostly on the Allied side is what interested me, knew or had heard that somebody died, or that there's a box somewhere in their home with the photos and the uniform and the medals. It wasn't a thing in our family either. Like, we knew one of our aunts had served, and I knew my father-in-law had, but they never talked about it to me because I was the next generation. Nobody ever talked about it unless there were those who did. There's a difference. It's like Holocaust survivors. You either talked or you didn't say a word because of the trauma. And of course, you can't equate the two. No, I would never do that. But so what happened was this: in the summer of 2011, I took, it was a family bar mitzvah in Israel. And on the way back, we went to Normandy with my kids, our kids. And one of our dear friends, who is a Canadian Order of Canada military historian and author, Ted Barris, said, you got to go to Normandy and you got to see Juno Beach and you have to see the Beny-sur-Mer cemetery. So we schlepped the kids. They weren't that interested because, as one was, they were young teenagers and it didn't mean anything to them. But we went to see the graves. And if you've ever been to a military cemetery, whether it's in Israel or anywhere, it's powerful, even if you have no idea who's buried there. And so we started to walk through the tombstone, right? And we would see gravestones. Every so often, there was a Star of David. So, of course, being Jewish, we went to see who they were. I wrote them all down, all the names. And one of the tombstones, I'm telling you, it changed our lives. It changed my life because what was written on it, the epitaph below the Star of David, was so emotional. It literally, he reached out and grabbed me from the grave after 70 years and said, hey, find out about me. Because it said, he died, so Jewry shall suffer no more. And I had to know, Jewry shall suffer no more. That's why he was there. That's why Jewish personnel all around the world, there were 1.5 million Jewish personnel who served in the Allied forces, in the Russian and the American, and 17,000 plus, close to 19,000 as it turns out, served in the Canadian forces. And yet their story has really never been told before. It's always Hollywood saying, oh, the Americans did everything. And even The Great Escape, Steve McQueen or what have you, but it was a Canadian story. Great Escape was a Canadian story. All those guys were Canadians, and there were Jews too. And of course, Jews were erased really from many of the accounts afterwards. So I found out about who this person was, because when you go to these graves, stones, and at the cemeteries, there's really nothing there to tell you. They're very sparse in their information. It turns out that his nephew was the president of our shul in Richmond Hill, Ontario, named after him. And my cousin was best friends with a niece. How much closer than that can you get? And there was a suitcase full of pictures. And everybody knew that this was the uncle that didn't come home from the war. And how did I find more? So I started with him. Then I found out his name was George Meltz, M-E-L-T-Z. And he was originally from Lithuania's family. And there were 10 kids. They came because of pogroms. They moved to Toronto. He was the youngest of 10 kids. They had 3 sets of twins in the family, and he was the baby. And many of the brothers served in the war, but he was the one who was killed. And he was a very new groom. He had just been married for about 8 months to a British Jewish girl.
You wrote in your book that nobody really knows who wrote the epitaph, but you think
we do know. We do know. I found out. Yeah. So it was his war bride, his widow. Yeah. She was a 19-year-old girl when he was killed, because he married in October 43, and by June of 44 he was in Normandy, and a month later, July 8th, 44, he was shot, or we think either a sniper or stepped on a mine. Nobody's really sure. But however, he didn't come home. And she was so brokenhearted about it, but also proud that he sacrificed himself to save the Jewish people. And 11 months later, the war was over. Not without great cost, but that was the motivation for many of the boys who went, and women from Canada who went, is to save the Jewish people from the final solution. They couldn't have known, Mel, what the extent of Hitler's evil design and his plan for the Jews was, because even though people kind of knew, and it did trickle out in the early 40s, they only came face to face when they hit Normandy. But they had relatives, they had uncles, they had aunts, they had cousins in, these countries that were not writing letters anymore, and they were not alive. And people knew that if they didn't stop Hitler there, he would come to North America and do the same thing.
Wow. So then you went on this mission.
So after I found out who George Meltz's family was, and started interviewing, and I wrote it for the local papers, then people started reaching out to me. What about my uncle? What about my brother? I know some, and it literally became a flood. So I had to do something, and I started reaching out and finding them. And I discovered this book. I'm going to show it to you. I don't know whether your viewers and listeners can see it. It's a brown.
The viewers can see it, the listeners can't. But so
it's a brown softcover book. It's almost like a softcover workbook that you get in school. Softcover brown, and it's called Canadian Jews in World War II, Volume 1 and Part 2. And this was published by Canadian Jewish Congress, which was the Canadian lobby group for Jewish community in that time, up until the 80s, actually. And they published pretty much the biographies and the names of everybody who served and was killed, wounded, or taken prisoner of war, the ones that they knew about. They collected all this information and they published it right after the war. And also another volume on who was the bravery medals, because about 200 Canadian Jewish men and women earned bravery medals for gallantry. in the war from the king.
Ellen, when was this published?
1947 and then 1948.
How hard was it for you to find these books?
So these exist, and they were in a library in the archives in Montreal. And so I went there to research and found this. And there's literally a list of, 700 and something names of those, the casualties. And I literally sat down with my mother, who is 85 now, and she's from Ottawa and has been involved with the community for many years. She knew a lot of the last names. So I know this person's daughter. I know this person. Oh, I grew up. So, and also I knew some of the names. And then we started emailing and researching it. I interviewed people. It took me 6 years to find them, but it also took a publisher, Malcolm Lester, the late Malcolm Lester, who published None is Too Many. I went to see him and I said, and None is Too Many is a famous book, which people might know about, by Irving Abella and Hirsch Troper from the University of Toronto, who proved that Canada's government in the 1930s closed immigration to refugee Jews who were trying to escape the Holocaust, and they sent most of them back. There was a very famous story on the MS St. Louis ship in 1939 before the war. They came here with 900 refugees and government said no. And they turned them back. It's a black mark on Canada's perception of Jews and immigrants.
I would say it's one of many black marks. We're going to go back to Canada in a few minutes.
Right. And so anyway, that's how we found all these names. And my publisher, Malcolm Lester, I had a coffee with him before he agreed to publish it. And I pitched him the story about the 450 who didn't come home. And he said, no, it's a better story. Give me the story of the 17,000 who went. So I went back to the drawing board a little bit after I had a little freak out, I have to say. And I started interviewing people who did come back, including my uncles and anybody that I knew who did come back. And so that's how it started, because the story is the same, just the ending is different. So that's how the book was born. He agreed to publish it with the New Jewish Press, as you mentioned, which was an imprint that he founded in the early part of the last decade, when there were no more kind of Jewish publishers, and he thought, I'm gonna take the newest, best books, and he took a chance on me because I'm a journalist for the past 45 years, but never written an actual book from scratch. So I was one of the first 5 that New Jewish Press published in 2018. He subsequently, it was sold to the University of Toronto Press, and that's where we live now.
Wonderful. So let's talk about his name was Friedman from Crete. I can't remember.
Fleischman. All right. So your friend, Dr. Vasiliki, this is what happened. And this is still what happens. I am Canada's expert on this topic. There are several of us historians, public historians, and there's a difference between someone with a PhD in history and then people who do this as journalists, but not with the training of a historian, but with a public historian and research skills. I'm a journalist. So there's me, there's someone in England who does this, and there's Operation Benjamin in the United States, and there's another one in Australia. So what we do is people write to us and they say, blah, 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 there's a tombstone of a person I know is Jewish in these Commonwealth war cemeteries. There are all over the world. The British government and the Commonwealth created these cemeteries after World War I for their dead, where they mostly are buried where they fell or near where they fell. Not the Americans. The Americans a lot of times brought the bodies home. But anyway, so back to Fleischman. So we got an email from the Jewish, an intern at the Jewish synagogue, Jewish community in Crete. I didn't even know there was one in Crete. And she said, there is a gravestone of a fellow here named David Fleischman, and it's got a cross on it. We want to prove that he was Jewish because we know he was Jewish. Can you help? I'm like, of course he was Jewish. It's all in my book. I wrote about him. But because it's complicated. So this is what we do. We are sleuths. And what we try to do is get proof, parents' marriage records, parents' burials if it's in a Jewish cemetery, parents, whatever, ancestry.ca and all kinds of websites. And the Canadian government publishes for free on its it's called the Library and Archives of Canada. You can get the military records of all the 44,000 Canadians who died in the Second World War online, or you can ask for it if you're a relative for free. Now, because of the pandemic, everything was shut down. It was much harder to get. Then it's still hard to get. However, you can get their attestation records, their wills, any documents that they signed up swearing their religion. Now, the trouble is, so David Fleischman, David Fleischman, came from Vancouver, and he was in the Air Force. And his father was president of the biggest conservative synagogue in Vancouver called the Shaare Zedek. And his mother was Jewish. And he had another brother, Neil, who also served in the Second World War, and a sister. But in his attestation papers, he wrote down that he was not Jewish. He wrote down Protestant. And that's very common. In fact, we know from my research, Mel, that at least 2,000 Jews did that in Canada. Now you can say, well, why would he do that? But the reasons are obvious. So what would you think would be the reason?
Well, we both know the reason. Do you want to tell everybody?
Well, there's two.
Being Jewish in Canada was a black mark. I want to wait a while before we go into anti-Semitism in Canada.
Yeah, all right, but it was dangerous for two reasons. Number one, and I found this out in my research because I interviewed hundreds of families and veterans. Every single one of them, except one, experienced anti-Semitism either before they entered the actual in uniform in the signing up process, even before they could get signed up. They were turned away from many of the regiments that weren't taking Jews. The Navy for sure was so British and very, very, we're only white Protestant people in the Navy, so we don't take Jews. And so it was very hard to get in. So that's one of the reasons they would have changed. Maybe some of them even changed their names. We know that they did. Sometimes they put down also for another reason. If they got captured by the Nazis and their religion was, because it goes on your identity discs. You guys, know it as dog tags, but it would say H on it. Instead of COE for Church of England, it would say H. So you had to have it on your papers so they knew how to bury you if you ever got killed, which is the thing. But then for Jews, if you got caught and they found your dog tags, your fate would be very dark indeed. And so they did it to protect themselves. And the problem was sometimes after they were killed, there wasn't anyone alive in the family, or the parents didn't get the letter, or the parents didn't want to answer, or they were too distraught when they started to work on the final gravestones, and the government sent them all this paperwork. So they never answered. And so, or they were married to somebody who was not Jewish, and she or he wanted a cross on the tombstone. And so that's what we think happened. They couldn't prove in 1945, when they started doing these graves, 46, they couldn't prove he was actually Jewish because he attested as not. And so that's why he was buried in a communal grave with a cross. Also because it was a crash. So there was very little remains left, and they just put them all in one grave, everybody on the flight on his plane. So I know his father was Jewish. I know because we have documents, newspaper clippings, books about it. The problem is that's not good enough you need to show them the parents were both Jewish. And then you have to write a letter to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission in England, and they evaluate it. And we've had many successes. I've done 3 for sure in the last couple of years that they changed to Magen David, which was beautiful, and the family is so happy. And others they've left as is because, as I said, unless there's overwhelming evidence, they won't do it. So I'm trying to track down the family of David Fleischman and trying to find anybody. And we're still on the hunt to try to do that and help the people in Crete get the Magen David on his tombstone.
So Vasiliki is she's actually the president of a synagogue, some Jewish organization. She's not Jewish, but I wish everybody was as Jewish as she is or isn't. So Vasiliki Efaristopoli for bringing us together. Now, you have, I saw lots of people in Ottawa. From Ottawa. I didn't know that you actually are from Ottawa. and your family's from Ottawa. We could play Jewish geography forever. That's
Ottawa
not
actually sent a lot of people to the war. It was one of the communities where pretty much everybody who was Jewish went. There were families, for example, Rabbi Mazer. He was the family, he had 9 children, and they had 9 children from the Adath Yeshurun synagogue. And I think they sent 7 of them, 2 were too young. That's a lot. My grandfather and his brothers, we have 3 of the brothers who served in each, one in the Air Force, one in the Navy, and one in the Army. My grandfather was too old, but he did other things.
These were the Leafs.
The Leafs. So Jaime and Joe
who were very prominent in Ottawa, and everyone knew them.
Right. And, it's a lot to send almost everyone. And the smaller the town, the more the people where everybody went, all the boys went, all of them. In Kamsack, Saskatchewan, it was a tiny, it was actually a large Jewish community for those days. Pretty much every single person in every family went.
I saw some names from Ottawa that I remember growing up, the Saslovs, and the Maloffs are also
yes,
Ottawans, and they feature in your book and many others. But here's the incredible thing. So before I interviewed you, I reached out to my cousin, Mona, whose dad was my uncle Jack Rosenberg, and I said, Mona, do you have any information beyond this laconic little paragraph that your dad was injured in Italy carrying a wounded soldier across a minefield? And she said, sorry, Mel, that's all we know. And here you have the book with my uncle Jack.
And this is what happens. I do this.
I didn't know he
pleasure.
I haven't cried on the show yet, but I'm crying now. And he was wounded 3 times during the war.
Well, this is what it says. So how I was explaining about these books this is an old copy. It's quite beaten up, but this is the one that's called Casualties. So there are about 790, including those who didn't come home, those who were wounded, and those who were taken prisoner. And they're all in there. I've found more that weren't, but it's pretty good for not having computers in those days. They all had letters from the rabbis or the chaplains, as they called them, the padres. There were 16 Jewish padres who went. And so there's on page 111, it says, here it is right at the bottom, Rifleman Jack Rosenberg, he was, and his service number was H64830, but that's not the H for Hebrew. It's just when his cohort enlisted, but it'll tell you, we know what year.
Does it say he was from Winnipeg?
Regina Rifles of Winnipeg was reported wounded in action in France on August 22nd, 1944. A second time on October 9th. So they patched him up and sent him back, or he wanted to go back. I don't know. And again on December the 13th of 1944. His mother lives at 335 Manitoba Avenue, Winnipeg.
That's
so we can find more, and I'll after we get off the air, I will do my research and find more for you. But she can get his records, and you can get his.
Well, my grandmother, it's from 335 Manitoba, Bella Rosenberg, and of course I remember Uncle Jack growing up. And you're going to help us get this record of his service.
It's free. Anyone can write away to the federal government for them. On my website, ellinbessner.com, ELLINBESSNER.com, there is a click. You can click to get the records, and it shows you how to go online and either literally print out one page and mail it or fax it, or you can just do it online and request the whole record if it's 20 years that he's been passed away. If it's less than 20 years, I'm sorry, you can't, because of Freedom of Information rules.
Well,
if they were killed,
we'll be in touch.
If they were killed, then you can get them. Anyone can get them. It's not just family, but if it's just family, you have to show next of kin. But it's very amazing. You'll find out all the hospital records, everything, and then you paint a fuller picture of what your relative did. It's very moving.
My uncle Isaac Rosenberg was also in the Army, and my dad was too young.
Same with mine, yeah. But we had 9 people in my family who served, and I didn't even know. I mean, we knew Auntie Daisy was one of the few women who served.
Look, I'm going to tell Jack's kids about Jack, you see, and that's thanks to you. So this mission, I understand now even more than I understood when I was reading your book. Ellin, let's now talk about anti-Semitism in Canada. I live in Israel. I left Ottawa when I was 17 because I was fed up with remarks that people made on occasion, like, too bad Hitler didn't kill all of you. This is in 1969, not in the 40s. And, I say to people here, you have no idea how anti-Semitic Canadians can be. And they say, oh, no, Canada, it's such a wonderful country. I say, well, what do you know about Canada? And I really don't know what it is like now, because I left 50 years ago because of anti-Semitism. But back growing up in Alta Vista in Ottawa in the 1950s and 60s, it was a terrible place for a Jewish kid. And this, we're not talking about 30s, and we're not talking about park benches that you mentioned in your book, no Jews or dogs allowed, or the golf courses or the hospitals. This was everyday life for a Jewish kid in a non-Jewish area in Ottawa in the 50s and 60s. And people don't believe me. And I look at your book and I say, oh, it's not just me, is it?
No, I interviewed, as I said, over 300 to 400 veterans, and I could have written a whole book about everything that happened to them, including in uniform, not just in the battlefield, but from their own comrades or from their superior officers who said the same thing. It's too bad Hitler didn't finish you, or when Hitler gets over, he'll come to Canada and clean out everybody. Like, this is what they were like, because Canada was a very unfriendly place for most Jews, especially because there was a lot of wide support for fascism in Quebec and in the prairies. Winnipeg had its own brown shirts in front of the market. In the 30s, there was a rally. There were fights and arrests because there were the Jewish community went out and tried to, stand up to, I forget his name, William Walker, I think was his, he was the leader of the brown shirts. So, there's a big, strong legacy. You want to know what it's like today?
And the numerous causes at the University of Manitoba, and probably all the universities.
Absolutely, they
actually. And my uncle Charlie Hollenberg, not being able initially to be dean of medicine at the University of Toronto, because
there were quotas.
We won't mention the chair that refused to have a Jew as the dean of medicine until they were threatened by the provost or the president. And Charlie Hollenberg told me, who's my cousin, told me this story.
Yes, sorry. Many people experienced it. But here's the thing. After the war, even though it took time, what I was told and what I learned is that because people were in the slit trenches, the Americans call them foxholes, or the barracks or the tanks, side by side with their comrades, or in prisoner of war camps, it became more accepted. They understood what the Jews were facing. And when they came home, Jews entered political life. So Senator David Kroll ran for parliament and became a senator, the first Jewish senator. Out west, we had the human rights legislation was created by a former prairie Jewish family who were the ones who were the Smith-built hats, this white Stetsons. One of their nephews was in the war, and then he came home, became a lawyer, and he helped draft human rights legislation. Same thing in Ontario. Joseph Glass, First World War veteran, came back from the First World War, entered politics, and again put in anti-discriminatory law about renting and employment. So it took time, but from what I've read, that is the war felt, and Senator Kroll said this, I felt like I belonged, and that Canada wanted and was sort of grateful.
So Ellin, one second. I was born in 1951, so that's 6 years after the war. I never felt Canadians accepted Jews. I never felt really welcome.
Sorry to hear that.
It took time. Me, and we're talking. We're talking 20 years. So are you going to make the argument that Canada now is a better place for Jewish people, that there isn't anti-Semitism in Canada?
No, of course I can't say that there's no anti-Semitism in Canada, but what I can say, and I'm not an apologist for either political or three of the political parties, the anti-Semitism is always there. It has been there, but the governments are spending money and effort, and they've adopted 6 out of the 10 provinces have adopted the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which means it's policy and law now about discrimination based on that. The governments are teaching Holocaust and anti-Semitism and racism in grade 6 in Ontario starting next fall. Many of you'll see over the next couple of years, the federal government gave millions to Holocaust museums, Jewish organizations to build new complexes in Vancouver, in Toronto, in Montreal, to teach tolerance and to teach acceptance and to teach what racism and bigotry and hatred can lead to. Whether this is going to be effective is a different story, but that's where they're going with it. And they're also helping the Jewish community by doing such as, they're coming out and condemning when anti-Semitism is on a billboard, or if it's on a tweet, or candidates meet with a far-right German political leader from the Alternative for Germany party, as happened a couple of weeks ago here in Canada. The Conservative Party, 3 of them met with her because she was here on a tour with the Freedom Convoy of truckers, but her party is anti-Muslim, anti-gay, and denies the Holocaust. They met with her at a lunch and took pictures, and their own leader basically denounced it. They had to apologize. And just today on the news, we learned that he tore a strip off of them in private in the caucus meeting. So and he's in the opposition, Pierre Poilievre. So I'm saying that while the anti-Semitism is more subtle now, the kids are doing it in schools with Heil Hitler salutes in the classroom, or making swastikas in the bathroom, or things like that. It's not just sitting there and being allowed to stay. Our allies are fighting back. The governments are condemning it. School boards, it's a whole different story. That's a bigger problem on campuses and on schools. That's a bigger problem, but it's more anti-Palestinian and anti-Jewish. That whole anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism has morphed a bit. And that didn't happen, of course, during the war, because Israel didn't exist. I'm so sorry.
Yes. So we didn't talk very much about your life as you have had an amazing career as a journalist. You interviewed Prince Charles, right? Or Prince Phillip? King Charles.
Yeah, he'll be King
one?
Charles. No, I interviewed Prince Phillip interviewed me, which was pretty funny. But I've been a foreign correspondent. Yeah. I've been a foreign correspondent. I work for CBC, CTV News, the Globe and Mail. I've been on television for many years, and now as the host of the CJN Daily podcast. So since I was pretty much 18, I've been a reporter. I come from a family.
And you're also a professor.
I taught for 20 years of journalism. Mm-hmm. So I've been a foreign correspondent and traveled all over the world to do stories. So I've been very, very lucky and privileged to see the world and get to talk about it. And now I focus only on Jewish matters, which is something I've always not been really able to do when I was working for mainstream media, because you have to be neutral and what have you. And so even though everyone knew I was Jewish, you had to cover everything, and you couldn't wear your heart on your sleeve. And so here I'm allowed to do that.
Wonderful. So we're not going to talk also about Israel, which is going through a terrible mess at the present. But
I do want to say one thing, though. Can I jump in for a minute?
You have to jump in. It's your interview.
So you mentioned we don't want to talk about Israel, but there is a big Israel angle here, and I have to say that because we're coming up to the 75th anniversary, of course, of the founding of the state. So there were 17,000 Jews who served in the Second World War. 450 didn't come home. But after the Second World War ended, as we knew, there was this whole Aliyah Bet. There was this whole movement to bring clandestine arms and ammunition to help the fledgling Israel's defense forces, Irgun and Haganah and Lehi, sort of fight and get ready to have a state in 46, 47, 48. So what happened was, and I write about it in my book, that many of these highly trained now Jewish veterans, so pilots that had won the Distinguished Flying Cross, like Dr. Bill Novick, and Sid Schulimson, who was the ace of Canada. He shot down 12 German ships sank 12 ships and shot down 7 planes. They had the know-how and they had the motivation, and they were able to then come to Israel clandestinely, secretly, and work with the IDF, and after the state was declared in the war of 1948 war. So of the Canadians, there were 300 who served as machalniks, which I'm sure your audience knows, which means mitnadim michutz la'aretz.
One
which
second,
is volunteers.
our audience are mainly not Jewish people.
Okay, so it means volunteers from abroad who were Jewish, mostly, not all, came to help the state of Israel's forces defend against the countries, Egypt and et cetera, that were ready to attack. So many of these people saw what the Holocaust had done and were burning with desire and knowledge and motivation to go back into battle and use their skills, because the Israelis weren't trained. Like, they were just a bunch of ragtag people, right? They didn't have equipment. They didn't have anything. They bought from Czech Republic. They bought from Canada. They smuggled stuff in, all at risk, because if the Canadian government had, I mean, maybe they sort of wink, wink, knew, but if they were caught fighting for another country, that's treason, right? So they would have been punished, but they did it. And I would say in 1948, we all know that what the outcome was. The state of Israel won the war. 11 Canadians were killed in the 1948 war from this Machal group. Many are buried in Israel. Some are Jewish, some are not. Even Buzz Burling is very famous. I'm not sure if your audience knows who he was. He was Canada's ace in the Second World War, not Jewish, but a born-again Christian, very committed to the state of Israel. And Sidney Schulimson, who was Canada's Jewish ace, convinced him to go and fight. He was the Eagle of Malta, I think his name was. He was on tour, and he was for the Bonds. Everybody, he was this gorgeous guy. He shot down so many planes because he had these eyes that could vector where the Nazis' Luftwaffe was going to be and shoot that way so that they would get it. Like, I'm not a pilot, but he wasn't shooting where the plane was. He was shooting where the plane was going to be. Anyway, and so he fought for the IDF, but unfortunately, because of sabotage, we think, he was killed, and he's buried in Israel now too. So that's the little story. And there is something that your listeners might want to do, and you may know about this. This year, there's a new museum in Latroon, Israel, which is being opened, and it's been in development for the last 5 years, called the Museum of the Jewish Soldier. And it's being opened, and it has several wings, and it tells the story of not just the Jews from Israel, but also from the Soviet Union, from South Africa, from Canada, a little bit, not much, from the American side, who came and fought in the Second World War, in other wars, and in Israel. And it's got artifacts from Canada there. And I highly recommend that you go when it's open. It's going to be beside the Tank Museum, which is in Latroon. So a little plug there for that museum.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you now a little bit of a difficult question, because you say it's almost 75 years since the War of Independence, and Israel now is in a predicament where some people think that our very democratic basis is going to be demolished. And I came when I was 18. I left Ottawa. I came for a year. I loved it here. And I said, wow, this is the one place in the world where I can be Jewish according to my definition of what being Jewish is. I don't have to go to synagogue if I don't like to. I can do more or less what I want to as a Jewish person, celebrate holidays as a secular person. And, you know, as a young kid, I went to synagogue every week. And here in Israel, I go to synagogue maybe once a year, and that's okay. And there's nobody here to tell me this or that. And I don't have a rabbi here because I don't need a rabbi here. But I would say 99% plus Canadian Jews, despite the Second World War, despite what you wrote about, chose to stay in Canada and to live their lives as Jewish people in Canada. for me, this is, I sometimes I feel abandoned, Ellen, because I can say a lot of bad things about Canada growing up and about anti-Semitism, but I can say a lot of wonderful things about Canada in its democratic ethic and its ethos, as in education and in treating your fellow man, the ethos, not necessarily the way it's. And I feel that if more Canadian Jews had come to live here, we would have a better country. And this might be self-serving, but I want to hear your thoughts.
Well, I'm glad you asked me that question.
Yeah,
because
I can't hear your thoughts. Now I can.
I can't. I'm sorry. I'm glad you asked me that question. It's an interesting point, and it was one that was actually on my show today on the CJN Daily, which was I interviewed the 103-year-old rabbi of Toronto, Erwin Shield, who just turned 103 today. Poo poo poo. And so he was
as we Jews say, bis 120.
Right, up to 120. So we went to speak to him, of course, about everything. He's a Holocaust survivor from Germany, survived Dachau, survived Kristallnacht. Anyway, it's a long story. You should listen to the interview. It's wonderful. And then Britain kicked him out as an enemy alien, as they did with so many thousands of Jewish Germans in the 1940 year, got rid of them and sent them to these remote POW camps in Canada for a couple of years, which was harsh conditions. Not as bad, of course, as Dachau, but very harsh. Anyway, he made his life here. So I said to him, are you bothered about what's going on in Israel? He said, I am bothered because we in Canada and in the United States, where it's safe and where we can live our lives as Jews however we want, should not be having an opinion about what the Israeli government is doing unless we pick up our house and move there. So that's what he said. And so I'm going to defer to him because I don't want to get into trouble with anyone who's listening. However, there are many Canadian Jews who are extremely, extremely worried about what is happening. There's thousands and hundreds of thousands that are protesting in the streets of Israel. As you know, for the last 9 weeks, many Canadians are in there. And we do have a big population of Canadian expats who are helping to build Israel. Sylvan Adams, for example, and Shauna Goodman-Sohn, and Gil Troy. And there's an association called Association of Americans and Canadians in Israel, AACI, which I speak to often. Marvin Stengi. There's so many people that moved to Israel. Robert Gassner, my friend Stephen Glazer. I could just spend the whole day telling about Canadians who moved there. So people can make their choice. They can visit, they can go, they can support from here. But we are all very worried about what is happening, whether you support more land for Judea and Samaria or you don't. That's your choice. And I'm not telling you how I feel. But we want to make sure that Israel continues to be the light unto nations, as Rabbi Shield said. And at the moment, that's...
We're
that is a very fraught question.
We're having trouble being a light unto ourselves.
Yeah, it's a fraught question, but it's one for Israelis to decide, not for us.
Yeah. So with all the Canadians in Israel, I feel, I'm telling you that I feel abandoned after 53 years here by the ones that stayed behind.
Some of our veterans, actually, that we talk about in the book, I'm going to get back to the book, they did make Aliyah. For example, Jerry Rosenberg, he fought in the Navy in the Second World War. He was from Hamilton, and then he was on the Beauharnois, and that became the whole Atalit incident, where I'm not sure if you're Altalena. I'm so sorry. Altalena incident. My bad. Altalena incident, where the Israeli, two different Israeli freedom fighter groups for fighting against each other during the 1948 war, and one opened fire on a ship that was carrying ammunition for the other one, and people were killed, and that was right off the beach of Israel. So that was a very black day for the Jewish state. But anyway, Jerry moved to Israel afterwards and stayed there and helped build the country. So that happened.
So yeah, but we needed more Jerrys.
Well, you have Ben Dunkelman, and you had a lot of people in my book who helped build Israel. He was the savior of Jerusalem, not just Mickey Marcus, but there was a Canadian one too, right? And Ben Dunkelman, who was the Gavadi Brigade, right? 7th Brigade.
You need a Kirk Douglas to portray you in Hollywood.
Well, You know, a lot of those people that are in Hollywood, if you scratch deep enough on those films, it's Canadians that were in those stories. And one of the things, I know you talked a little bit about how, if we have time for this,
Yes.
one more thing. You talked about how you usually do children's books. So I wanted to show your listeners and tell show our viewers that in the Second World War, the Canadian Jews who served fought in all the major battles. D-Day, Ortona, in the Russian convoys. They were in Hong Kong. They were in Alaska. They were in Africa, in Tobruk, and against the battles in Italy, of course. As you mentioned, your uncle was in Italy. That was a Canadian story. Italy was the Canadians liberated most of Italy. So the Canadian Jewish Congress, which was the main mobilizing force at the time in Canada, basically were the Canadian lobby group. They wanted to show kids that Canadian Jews were heroes in the war. So what they did is they commissioned these comic books that were put out in 1943 and 1944. There were 3 of them, and they gave them away for free to the kids to show who was fighting. And so this is a copy of one, and I'm holding it up. It's photocopies, and it shows a football player. It shows a man in a kilt with a uniform, and that would be David Kroll, and the one on the left, and it's called Jewish War Heroes Special Canadian Edition. And what they did was they hired these artists who did the main American ones that were like Captain Canuck and I don't know, all these famous ones from the wartime. And so here's Ben Dunkelman, and they had all these real graphic novels to make the kids really interested in who they were and who their heroes were. So that is a very interesting one, including one which was never published. I want to show it to you. It was called Some Never Die. These are the panels for it, for Sergeant Samuel Moe Hurwitz, who, if you want to know some of the most famous Canadian heroes of the Second World War, Moe Hurwitz was one of those. He won 2 extremely important medals and was killed in Holland. He was a tank commander, and he was also a hockey player. In fact, he was scouted from Montreal. He played for one of the junior teams in Montreal, professional hockey in the 30s and 40s. And he was scouted by the Boston Bruins because he was so good. He also had huge penalty minutes. And all of your listeners will know hockey is a religion in Canada. And so the Bruins scouted him to come down and try out for the Boston Bruins hockey team, which was a big deal. As you said, there was so much anti-Semitism for a Jewish boy to get, accepted, invited to play professional hockey was a big deal. So he said, how can I play hockey when millions of my brothers are being killed? And he turned them down, and he joined the Tank Corps. And he was killed. He knew he wasn't going to come back. He told his brother, Harry, that he wasn't going to come back. So his story is in the book and also in the comic, which was never published, sadly. But we have a copy, and we gave it to the family from the archives.
So the book is so full of wonderful tales, and it's so down to earth and heartfelt. And before we close, 2 of my childhood heroes, not because they were tank commanders, but because they were so funny. And that's Wayne and Schuster, who also ended up serving in Europe and being shot at. And here, this is my final question to you, Ellin, because we can go on all day in Toronto and all night here in Israel. As a kid, I would watch Wayne and Schuster, oddly enough, mostly on Christmas, which is ironic. But most Christmas carols were written by Jewish people anyway. And I would watch Wayne and Schuster, and I didn't know that they were, in their own way, war heroes. And I never knew much about my Uncle Jack's service. And I'm wondering, why do you have an answer for this? The Jewish service in the war, which we should have been so proud of as kids, we didn't know about. How come I'm reading this book now when I'm 71 years old? I should have read it when I was 11.
I should have wrote it when you were 11, but unfortunately, the same thing happened.
When I was 11, you didn't exist.
I was a twinkle. They didn't know because here's the thing. First of all, PTSD. So we know now what that is. post-traumatic stress. In those days, the veterans came home, they drank, they got divorced, they killed themselves early, they were wounded. This happened, their family suffered, or they were fine, but they had other things. So like my Uncle Leo, who the book is dedicated to, he was in the RCAF, he was fixing planes in Europe. And I asked him, I was told, like, he never talked about it, not even to his kids. So when I started doing the interviews in 2014, just before he passed away, he was my first interview. And I said, why didn't you talk about it? Why didn't you go to the veterans, like November 11th days at the synagogue in Montreal?
Why didn't you come to the synagogue? Why didn't you
go to speak
to my school? I went to Hillel
exactly.
Academy.
Right.
Ottawa.
Why didn't you speak? So he said, he actually threw away his uniform when he came home. And he told me, he always used to say he was in the Secret Service. That's the family joke. Did you serve? Why don't we know about it? He says, because it was a Secret Service, which was a joke. But it was his way of saying, and then he explained to me, he said, I saw men that didn't have an arm, they didn't have a leg, they lost their hearing, or died, they were disabled for life. I came home just with hearing problems because he was working in the Air Force, right, with the planes. I felt I was lucky. So I decided to build a life, make a family, make a living, and not talk about it anymore because I wanted to put it behind me because I was lucky. That was his way. And I think that was true for many. Now, there were lots of Jewish people, Mel, who were in the Jewish war veterans associations after the war, the Jewish legions, all across Canada. They had these groups where the Jewish men would come and they would march on, with their Stars of David hats and their blazers, what have you. But I don't think that anyone asked them. And it was too soon to talk about it. And then a lot of kids your age, no offense, they rolled their eyes. Oh, there's those stories again. So it took the grandchildren who had to write projects for grade school and okay, go interview a veteran for Remembrance Day. So you call up your grandfather, your uncle, and say, what did you do in the war? And it took people of my generation to ask. But the problem is I didn't start until it was so late that there were so few left. So that's part of my mission, was to give voice to those who were no longer here to talk about what they did for Canada, what they did for the world. Canada liberated so many survivors. They liberated Westerbork, which was the camp where Anne Frank was transferred out of north of Amsterdam. The Canadians helped, they liberated Vught, which was in southeastern Holland, which nobody knows that there's an actual death camp called Sertingebouth, Camp Vught. There was a guy who liberated Bergen-Belsen. Lots of Canadians, 1,000 Canadians were at Belsen and helped the British after the war and did what they did. So for them, and for those who are still alive but are not able to speak anymore, that's what this work is for. Because the Canadian government never recognized the Jewish contribution they have a whole page on their website. They did until my book. So they talked about honoring, who served. So it was Black Canadians and Chinese Canadians and Japanese, very, very few. There was a lot of racism, a huge amount of racism against those groups too. Women, hockey players, etc. But there was nothing about the 20,000 Jews. It was for 40% of all the Canadians who served. And 40% of all non-Jewish Canadians served, also 40% of Canadian Jews served, and there were only 160,000 Jews in Canada at the time. Think about it. It was a minority of a big minority, and yet they went at great risk to themselves. Because if they were caught, as we discussed, and because their own people were being annihilated, and they were having anti-Semitism even in the army too. So their experience was unique. And until my book came out, there was nothing on the website about Jewish service. So now they graciously put a beautiful web exhibit up so that the Jewish voice is there, and my book is still being used. Lots of people are learning about it, like your listeners and viewers. And that's my voice, is to give those their stories and what they did, legacy. And so I'm really happy you let me do that.
So as we Jews say, Yisher Koach, which means more power to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your uncle for serving. 3 times he was wounded. I can't wait to find out more.
Incredible. So I've been talking with the wonderful Ellin Bessner, Professor Ellin Bessner, about her mission and her incredible book, Double Threat. The subtitle is Canadian Jews, the Military, and World War II. So
available
Ellin,
for purchase at many fine bookstores. You can go to my website, ellinbessner.com, through the U of T, through Amazon.
Ellin with an I.
Ellin with an I. And if anybody has any questions, Mel, I would be happy if they reached out through you or to me directly through my website. I can help you find your family stories or whatever you'd like to know.
Please send me stuff about my Uncle Jack.
And also, if they want to hear more, I have a website, as I said, ellinbessner.com.
We will, like, this will be on Facebook and on YouTube and the podcast, and you and I will share the links.
And also, if they want to listen to Canadian Jewish news about all things Canadians and Jewish, including Israel and Florida in the winter and Arizona, then you can go to the CJN.ca and find us, or on all your favorite podcasts. It's been an honor to speak with you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm
deeply honored. Ellin Bessner, thank you so much. I hope this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship.
Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.